Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network.
I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda.
And we're your hosts.
We're a traveling couple and digital nomads taking you on our adventures as we explore locations, destinations, and careers.
Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the World Wanderers podcast. We are very excited and grateful that you are joining us for today's episode of the show. And today on the podcast, we are excited to be joined by Jason Robinson from the Nomad Experiment. And we actually had Jason on the podcast for The Insider. The Insider is for Patreon supporters only. It's our $5 a month membership where you get one amazing bonus piece of content per month, all about how to live a nomadic life or how to become a digital nomad. And this episode was so good with Jason. We just wanted to share it with you guys on the regular feed. Not only does it give you some insight into what is behind the paywall on the Insider, but it also is so full of inspiring travel stories as well as tips for anyone who wants to start working and traveling or is wanting to start working and traveling in the near future that we wanted to share it here. At age 39, Jason had only seen 2 countries outside the United States for a grand total of 2 weeks. And so his nomad journey actually started a little bit later in life. And since then, he's been able to explore so many different corners of the world. He's been documenting his way around the world through his YouTube channel and his website and his blog, The Nomad Experiment. And so he's got so much good, inspiring stuff to share through this episode.
Yes, so let's dive into it. And as always, if you want to get access to the World Wanderers Insider, where this episode was originally released about a month ago, you can head over to patreon.com/theworldwanderers. Right, now on to the interview. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're really excited to have you and talk about your journey. Just kind of reading more about your experience, kind of getting into travel a little bit later than like the average nomad and kind of making that a reality. So we're excited to dive in. And I thought a good place to start would just be to kind of figure out how you kind of got hooked on travel. I know you started the nomad adventure a little bit later on into your 30s, but what were kind of your early travel experiences like and what kind of got you hooked?
Interestingly enough, I didn't have a lot of early travel experiences. That's kind of where it started, was the lack of travel. Honestly, by the time I was 19 years old, I'm from Akron, Ohio, a small blue collar factory town. And, we used to go camping and hiking in the summer. We didn't go to other states. We didn't go out of the country, things like that. And while I was happy with that, I really didn't understand that there was this possibility that I could do these other things. The first time I really left Ohio was in college. I went to visit my dad, who had recently moved down to North Carolina, visited him 4 or 5 times. And it was when I was 23, still in college, because I took the long route, that I realized that I could actually maybe move away from my hometown. And that was kind of the first, okay, I'm 23 years old and I just figured out that I can, move away. Over the next 2 years, traveling regionally, went on a trip to London with work at about 25. And honestly, up until about age 39, I was only out of the US a total of, I think, about 14 days, which includes that 1-week trip to London back when I was 25. So, 39 years old, I had dabbled in travel a little bit and dabbled in hostels and alternative travel. I just knew that there was, I'd read so much from bloggers and seeing people that I knew that travel wasn't this big expensive beast that everybody thought it was. And I also wanted to prove to myself that the world isn't this scary place that maybe I had been led to believe, and, that everybody's inherently good. And I just kind of wanted to prove that to myself. So, late 30s, started these experiments to really push my comfort zone and started traveling then.
Yeah, and I know I was watching, you have a really cool video talking about your big map that you had at your house and how that impacted and kind of led you to be a bit more motivated to see the world. Could you talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah, actually, it's funny. That was about two years ago. So I started all of these real I'm super type A, analytical, like art director, always making sure that the boxes are checked. And when you have that mentality, you kind of got to let go of things a little bit. So shortly after I started these experiments, I was I always admired the people that had the pins in their maps, and they had like hundreds of pins all over the world. And I'm like, I want one of those. Well, I went out and bought one and I put all my pins in the map, and I realized that there weren't very many pins, and they were all concentrated around, about 20 states within the US. And that was really the first moment that I realized, with this whole digital age that we have, that we have access to maps upon maps upon maps, but there's no actual scale to those maps. There's no comparison game. But once I got this big map on my wall and I got the pins in it of these minuscule little dots where I've been, I went, oh my gosh, I've barely even opened the cover of this book of travel that I have the opportunity to have. So of all the things I've gotten rid of, a year ago, I sold my house. A little over a year ago, I sold my house and went completely nomad. And that's actually one of the things that I keep. It's under my dad's bed back in Charlotte, North Carolina. And every time I go back, once I've gotten to some new destinations, I pull it out and I put some new pins in it.
Yeah, that's the downside about being a nomad, is that you can't keep like an awesome map with all your travel destinations on it.
Still got it. It's just relocated.
No, I love it. I'm glad that you're keeping that and still adding to it when you're back home. And we have a scratch map, and it's interesting. It's a lot smaller, it sounds like, and it rolls up really easily because it doesn't obviously have anything in it. But I had sort of a similar, I guess, experience of like, you start scratching off the places you've been and you realize like how big the world is. And I feel like that really opened my eyes to how many places there are still to explore. And it kind of it just puts a little bit of fire underneath you to keep going with it. And something I'd love to hear about is just kind of the decision to like go nomadic, because I think there's a lot of people who want to travel more. They have this urge or this feeling like, I'd like to see the world a bit more. But the idea of selling your house and selling your stuff can be super, super scary for a lot of us. What actually kind of got you to that point?
It really was this experiment mentality that I had this epiphany one day, and I literally started viewing things as an experiment, and that gave me the freedom to try things without this pass fail mentality, and I didn't have to find an answer in one little experiment. So essentially, I said, I saw all these van lifers and these digital nomad backpack travelers, and you start to make all this conjecture. Oh, that would be an amazing life. Oh, that would be super fun. Oh, a van would be really easy to live in. And you can read articles all you want all day long, but until you actually start testing those things, you're never going to truly know. And it seems a little bit silly to just sell all your stuff and then go, oh man, I really don't like this lifestyle. So I started, before I even, bought my first one-way ticket to Mexico, I started traveling domestically just to push myself a little bit more and see if I enjoyed, going to a city, staying in a hostel, working from that hostel on my laptop, and, living like that. And I stacked up a bunch of those trips. And I always told myself, okay, this is, you can stop doing this whenever you hit that point where it's no longer fun, or it's no longer comfortable, you're no longer growing or getting out of it whatever you want to get out of it. So I always gave myself that flexibility to kind of be flighty, is what I call it. People think it's weird when you change your mind all the time. I think in our society that's viewed down upon. Maybe I've kind of flipped that on its head, and I said, dude, you're trying stuff, like you're growing more than most people are growing. So allow yourself to do that. And I stacked a bunch of domestic trips up, started travel hacking a little bit. And once I got to that point, I said, okay, if you really want to see what this backpack lifestyle is about, you probably need to test that out. So I bought a one-way ticket to Mexico, and that was my first trip to Mexico. That was only the fourth country I ever saw, and that was at 39. And I kind of went for 3 weeks there, and I said, okay, see what you're comfortable with. You can book a flight home in 2 days if you want to, but a week later, I hopped the bus to Oaxaca from Mexico City, and then a week later after that, I went with a bunch of new friends to Puerto Escondido, cracked a rib surfing, and ended up going home a few days later. But I started just testing the waters of what that felt like to be completely nomadic, and there's tons more little experiments that I did. For instance, I downsized my entire life into my bedroom. The only clothes that I owned were down to my bedroom as I progressed through these goals, so that I could feel what it might be like to live in a van and, not have very many belongings. So I kind of did all these things to push my comfort zone and see, if I still enjoyed the next step. I didn't sleep in my bed for 1/4 of the first year. The next year, I didn't sleep in my own bed or in my home for 1/3 of the year. So, being more and more nomadic while still having my home. And then that next year, I just said, I'm over it. I don't want it anymore. I don't want the responsibilities that come with place. Let me go all in. And at that point, I was just ready. I sold my house within 2 months and got rid of everything. And there you go.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that idea of looking at it like an experiment. I think so often we get into our heads about things and we treat things that are totally reversible as if they're not, even something like selling your house and going traveling, you could think about it for ages and ages and ages. But if you do that and you find a year or 2 years down the road that there are some things that you liked about owning a house that you felt like you're missing out on. Well, guess what? There's still houses out there.
Yep.
They haven't gone away. And so one thing I'm curious about with making these transitions and kind of diving deeper and deeper and deeper, did you have to make a career change at that point, or what did things look like on the career side?
I didn't make a career change. So, I've been self-employed, a contractor, freelancer, whatever you want to call it, since I was 28 years old. So essentially the small design firm that I was at dissolved. I took half the clients. My old boss took half the clients. So I kind of started my my career with a track, but that was a very location dependent position that I held with myself. I actually used to work on a lot of super high profile architectural projects at airports. So, Charlotte Douglas International Airport, a lot of regional airports where I was their go-to guy on the ground in that region. And these folks were coming from architectural firms in Washington or in California. So they kind of pinned me to that location, and every big contract that I took pinned me in for another 2 or 3 years. So through my, pretty much from 28 to 38, I kept getting these moments where I had to make a choice. I could either take this next big contract, knowing that it was going to tie me to place for another 2 to 3 years, and then that I would get another one for another 2 to 3 years, and they overlapped, or I had to pull the plug and I had to say, okay, you're going to rebuild. And that's essentially what I did. There was a point 3 years ago where I had 2 of my main clients come to me and say, all right, we want you on this team. And I had to look at both of them and say, I'm going to choose not to do that. And actually one of them got kind of pissed off because they thought I just didn't want to work with them. And I had to kind of get on and talk to them and say, no, I'm making a life change. I'm going to rebuild with all of my clients or any of my, work relationships with going into it. The first thing being that I will be working from wherever I need to in the world. I'm not going to be, waiting by my computer to communicate with you. These are the terms that we're setting up these relationships with. And that was super simple to do in theory. Obviously, I had 6 months there where my income was very low as I was rebuilding. But, people are interested in somebody who has interesting stories or the courage to do things that a lot of people don't do. They want to work with you. They want to, they kind of want to be along for that ride. And if you set up your expectations right out of the gate, just like you should any good work relationship or, professional relationship, there's really not much difference to it. My brain had just kind of made me think that I had to be staying in Charlotte, North Carolina to do my job. And I kind of had to rewire myself for that. So yeah, I did have to pull the plug on all of my clients, over 90% of my income, and pretty much live on ramen for a year while I rebuilt. But there's something else that goes with that is when you're, and this is the most common sense, silly statement, but I go back to it again and again. If you don't spend as much, you don't need to make as much. And I think that a lot of people in our society, they don't realize how much money they're spending on things that they don't necessarily get, good enjoyment out of, or the value isn't there for the time that they're trading to make the money to have those things. And you guys know travel is something that you just get so much more out of it. My experiences are so much more in depth.
Yeah. I really love that. So many good points in there. I think that just kind of starting from that end, that one about, I think so many people don't realize how, like, yes, leaving, whether it's Canada, Europe, the States, and going somewhere else gets you a lot more adventure, but it also can really bring down your cost of living and be quite good from like a professional standpoint. Like if you're trying to make that transition to, I don't know, maybe working from home and you're going to move to Austin or somewhere in the States, the amount of money you need to be making is like 4, 5, 6 times higher than it is if you're in Mexico and you can travel around to go to different places in Mexico. And if you're making, $1,500, $2,000 a month in Mexico, like you're golden, like life is good. And then kind of on top of that idea of like, just committing to it and knowing like, hey, there's going to be some pain, but I'm going to make that transition. And this is just going to be like a non-negotiable for me. I think that's really, really like courageous to do, because I think a lot of people are like, especially with like big clients and what sounds like really fulfilling, interesting, and kind of significant work, to make that change definitely seems like it requires a lot of courage.
Yeah, it's funny. My dad actually asked me that year. I pulled the plug on that stuff in April of that year, and I was hanging out with my dad around Christmas time, and he wasn't yet on board with things. It took some of my family and friends quite a while until they saw what I was really doing and that this was sustainable. And your parents care about you, so he was just worried about his little boy. But he asked me, he's like, "Aren't you just scared and stressed out every day?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "But honestly, I don't have more money now than I did when I was 28 or when I was 18. I never learned how to save. I never learned how to do any of those things." I said, "So I was insecure about my situation then. I was insecure about it, in the interim, and I'm still now." I said, "But the difference is I'm inspired." And, that alone was the different complexion of that fearfulness or that stress. Like I knew that was only momentary, that I would get through that. But on the other side of it, there was this different life. Hopefully, assuming everything worked out, which it did, there's this different feeling about life. And I've written about it recently, just that feeling of adventure that I really don't feel that I had for that previous 10 years. And now I have that feeling of adventure, even if it's just walking outside of, wherever you're staying in this, Mexican city, and walking the streets. It's unique. It's new. It makes me want to write. It makes me want to pick up a camera and do a YouTube video. Like that actually inspires me to be more productive than I ever was. So it's an interesting kind of contradiction in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. We can definitely relate to that as well. And one thing I'm curious about is if you have any tips for anyone who is maybe in a career where they feel like they're not able to, just drop everything and work and travel. How do you kind of navigate that if you're in a career where you feel like maybe it's not like a traditional career that would be like nomad friendly?
For better or worse, this pandemic has shown us that even those of us with the more remote frame of mind, we're even being surprised at what more traditional jobs are being able to, getting done on the internet or via Zoom and things like that. So I think, the breadth of possibilities is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. One crazy suggestion is to get out of debt. I know that sounds super light as far as how much debt people can be in, but when I was 28, I was $50,800 in debt, and I was single, living by myself, and I realized it, and I went, "Oh man, I got to fix this." And 4 years later, I was debt free. The reason I did that was because I liked a girl, and I wanted to be debt free if we ever went to the next level. That never happened. But the byproduct was that the freedom that I have from that really allowed me to not have to overthink every financial decision. And it's really hard to explain that to somebody who may carry commercial debt, who's never been debt free, but it is the most freeing possible. Again, I'll explain that one unless you see both sides of it. And then the next thing is start having those conversations with your boss, with your management, and don't assume that it is not possible, or don't assume that there's never a chance. I had a friend who, he and his wife, they both went nomadic the same month that I did. And they had they have a kid and a dog. So they were actually doing that with their whole family. And I told Ross, I said, he was going to quit his job. He's like, they're not going to go for it. They want me in the office. They want me on the team. I'm like, dude, don't do that without having the conversation with them. What's the worst that can happen? They can say, you're right, we don't want that, have fun. And they looked at him and they said, no, we really value your work. What kind of situation do we need to do to keep you on board? And they kept him on board for 20 hours a week, which essentially gave them a massive amount of income that he was already writing off. So just, have conversations with people, say, I'm thinking about these things, gauge their interests, try, there's a lot of books out there about kind of pushing the envelope with your work to prove to your management before they even know it that you're capable of doing these things and doing them better. Plus, there's probably a lot of reports out now, after being in a pandemic and people working remote, at the productivity level, either being similar or better whenever you're not inundated with water cooler talk and the stress levels that come with commuting and things like that. I think there's a massive trade-off that's being talked about now. And that's why a lot of these companies are going to cut the overhead and let people continue to work remote.
Yeah. I think it's going to be, well, it already has been, but especially in the future, as we get through this and travel is like more and more accessible for people, the leap from like, well, I moved out of San Francisco, or I moved out of New York, and now I'm living in like a smaller town, to like, maybe I should go to Mexico, or maybe I should go to South America. Like that's not far down the road. But I do really like that point about, I think so many people, and I'm definitely one of the people who've done this too, we think of our work relationships as like these like fixed states, and we're so kind of intimidated by the like cultural and like the norms around work that we don't really understand the flexibility that's there. Like, work is just like an agreement between you and somebody else, where you said you'll do something and they said they'll do something. And so kind of everything's negotiable there. And sometimes you find out the answer is no, but a lot of the times you find out the answer is yes. So we kind of like box ourselves in these corners where we think, oh, my job, I need to be in the office for my job, or I need to be in the city for my job, or I need to work full time. But often if you go and talk to people and are persuasive and you've done a good job at work for 6 months or a year or 2 years, you're valuable, and people will make accommodations to keep you on board.
Well, and you mentioned something earlier that, you just made me think back to it. I have this theory of blips on the timeline. And I think that our perspective looking backwards is so much more skewed than our projection looking forward, or the way that we view decisions or impactful things that happen in our life. So, think about that girlfriend or boyfriend that just ripped your heart out when you were 18 years old, and you thought that was the person you were going to marry and they were going to spend the rest of your life with them, or the one that happened when you were 24 years old, or that job that you had. Like, at the time, those things were just massive, monumental change that felt cataclysmic. But in looking back, you're like, what was that person's name again? So I think, I'm writing a book right now, and some of the research showed that the average person, by the time they're 40 years old, holds like 10 jobs. And by the time they retire, they've held more than 15 jobs. So, even looking at it from that perspective and saying, okay, I've only held 3, so I got plenty of time for flexibility and to try some new things. I think we do just tend to forget that all of the things we've done, all of the things we've learned, the relationships that we've built, or all those things, like, we know how to do those things. We have those things in our back pocket. We don't forget how to do our job that we've been doing for 10 years. If we choose to take 6 months off, we can always go back and do those things with, maybe a little bit of a pay cut. I could have gotten rid of my house and 6 months later said, wow, that was a huge mistake. Let me go buy that exact same house. And yes, it would have cost me $15,000 more, but I could have put myself back in that exact same situation with more knowledge and more understanding of who I am and, what I want with relatively little repercussions on a 30-year mortgage, So yeah, I think we don't give ourselves enough credit for what we've learned up until our certain points in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. So thanks for bringing that up. And obviously the whole travel world has been hit pretty hard in the last year, and it's been a pretty, I guess, strange experience, I think, for us, those of us who are travelers and nomads. And you were down in Mexico when the pandemic hit, and then you headed back home to the US. Is that right?
Yeah, I was in Mexico for 2 months back at the beginning of 2020, and came home right after the president said we're going to start shutting down airlines.
Yeah, we were not long behind you heading back to Canada. Trudeau said, "Canadians, you need to come home." And that was the first time I've ever experienced something like that. And we were like, I guess we're going home. And then we spent 7 months in Canada. Are you still in the US?
Yeah, I'm still in the US. So after I sold my house, I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for 15, 17 years. So I have plenty of friends and family and things like that. So I'm a little bit nomadic within the States at this time. I'm up in Michigan right now with some friends that I spent, 3 or 4 months with this year at a lake house. And, we all work from home, and I do that whenever I'm in Charlotte. So yeah, I've only gone on a few trips during the pandemic. I actually did drive out west and went and did the Rubicon Trail, and did some off-roading out there and hit a couple of national parks. But for the most part, I've been kind of watching. I mentioned to you guys about 3 months ago, I found out that I have type 1 diabetes, which was a little bit's probably a light way of saying it was pretty crazy revelation. So the complications that come with COVID and having that diagnosis have me kind of settled in for another few weeks until hopefully I can get my vaccine and feel more comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, a strange time, like I said before. And I think that every person needs to make their decisions individually. And it definitely sounds like you're making the right decision for you. One thing that I'm really curious about is just going from this like nomadic life where you're going to places like Mexico and you can basically have the freedom to go anywhere, to just kind of being a little bit more grounded in the US. What's that been like in terms of kind of your nomad experience?
Yeah, that's been tricky, especially since I literally sold my house May 17th of 2019, drove across the US for 2 months, went over to Europe for 2 months, went to Mexico for 2 months, with some time in between, and then all of a sudden got grounded back to the US. So I went from very location dependent to, okay, I'm changing my life and I get to do all this, travel and world travel, to nope, no, you don't. Now you get to go back to this thing you don't even know what it is. So the first 2 or 3 months, I'm not going to lie, I'm very, I'm an open book. The first 2 or 3 months were just bummed out, like I mentioned earlier, you have that enthusiasm whenever you're traveling and you're experiencing new people and new cultures and new foods. Like there's this energy, and to be grounded, obviously we're very lucky to be in the position we're in, or have to, work to do what we're doing. But the reality is there that when you have a life that you create and then it goes completely backwards, it stings for a minute. So the first 2 or 3 months were pretty just, uncomfortable, not very enthusiastic about getting personal projects, passion projects done. So just getting the work done that I needed to get done to pay the bills was, first and foremost. And then after that, just got in those rhythms that I think that people tended to get in, where, you just get back to normal and say, this is the new normal, and we'll push through it and start looking forward to the next travel. Where I'm at now is starting to understand travel insurance even more than I had to before, which I appreciate your recent podcast. You guys talked a little bit more about travel insurance. And so things like that I'm learning a lot more about before I get back on the road. And honestly, I've been able to buckle down. I've been writing a book, and that has really come a long way with this free time that I have, and just continuing to kind of refine some of the things I've been working on for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. I think if you looked at our alcohol purchases over the first few months of the pandemic, you would see that we are probably in a similar situation.
Yeah.
First for a few months, are we being honest here?
Maybe the entire time before we left.
We did a dry month when we got to PV because we were just like, man, this has gotten so out of control. And PV is like a weird place to do a dry month, which we fully acknowledge, but it's just like the change of atmosphere was like, okay, we need to make a change because this has just it's been a rough half of a year.
Well, you picked a good way to do that because you went from cold, fairly cold fall, winter Canada to a place that excels in being outdoors and getting your exercise and things like that. So that was a good time for you to make that choice.
Yeah. I mean, it's been like a real blessing being down here in Mexico, that Mexico has remained open because like you said, like you can do so much stuff outdoors. And like it's so much easier to like social distance and for restaurants to put tables apart when they can just do it all outside and don't have to be like in Canada. It's freezing. You have to be inside if you're going to do any of that stuff. So definitely a blessing. And so just to kind of, before we wrap things up, do you want to tell everyone kind of, and maybe you're not at this point yet, but just kind of like about the theme of the book and then where they should go to find out more about you and to check out your videos?
Oh yeah, sure. So the book, I've actually been working on it for the past year since the pandemic started. And it is taking everything that I've learned in the past 3 or 4 years, going from corporate 9 to 5, location dependent, person who never really traveled to where I'm at now and how to use all of the mechanisms that I had to use personally to go from beginner traveler to world nomad or anywhere in between. So, a lot of the anecdotes that I've learned along the way, during my travels or the situations I've been in, along with just some, real brass tacks. I write the way that I speak. I've been, I kind of have a sailor's mouth whenever I'm writing and in personal conversations. So it's kind of that brass tacks, nitty gritty, have a good time while you're learning, but let's get down to it. And it's also a little bit of a self-help book because I'm all about a well-rounded person. You can't choose to travel without understanding, your financial impact or the financial impact on the world or the environmental impact or the personal impact or the emotional impact. So, there's a little bit of everything in the book. Because especially traveling as a solo traveler, it's an isolating experience. So how do you avoid that? How do you put yourself in positions to, create community immediately when you hit the ground? Or how do you manage that money on the road or look at money differently than the normal American or just the normal citizen does? Your money acts different around the world. So how do you retrain your mind into this more of a travel lifestyle if you've never had that before? So it's kind of a blueprint for beginner travelers, no matter what age, to say, okay, I'm not one of those 20 somethings who's traveled for 10 years already. I need some of the basics along with some of the advanced stuff to maybe go full nomad if I want to go there.
Awesome. And when should people kind of have their eye out for that?
That will be coming out end of first quarter 2021.
Okay, awesome. All right. And then, so where should people go to connect with you if they want to do that online?
The easiest place to see kind of all the crazy experiments and all the words is at the nomadexperiment.com. And probably the easiest place to follow me is Instagram at the Nomad Experiment. Tend to put a little bit of my words over there, but I also love travel photography and murals and graffiti and things like that. So that's really a fun platform for me to share some of the things that I see and some of the words that I'm writing.
Awesome. Yeah. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I was watching a few of your videos and lots of great content on Mexico and other places and overall topics. So definitely go check out the videos as well. So Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's been great. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want more, make sure to check out the World Wonders Insider, available on Patreon at patreon.com/theworldwanderers.
For show notes, head over to theworldwanderers.com. Find us on social media at The World Wanderers Podcast and join the private Facebook community at World Wanderers, a community for travelers.
You can always get in touch with us at info@theworldwanderers.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us find new listeners.
See you next time.